Brian Daniels spent his whole life building an empire on lies, convinced he was the master of the game, that people would eat up whatever truth he fed them. He thought he was untouchable, that his words shaped reality itself. But in one night, in one live broadcast, she shattered his illusion and exposed what was really happening behind the scenes. There's a certain kind of silence that only happens right before something massive goes down. Not just any awkward silence. No, this is the kind that comes when people sense a shift in the air, something they can't quite put their finger on, but they know it's about to be big. That was the studio tonight. Everything looked normal on the surface. The polished news desk, the blinding studio lights, the massive cameras, positioned at perfect angles. The control room behind the glass where producers sat with headsets, watching the screens like chess players mapping out their next move. It was all a routine, but if you really paid attention, you'd see it. The way the crew members were holding their breath just a little. The way the camera operators weren't as relaxed as usual. The way Brian Daniels' smile, confident and cocky as ever, just barely twitched when he looked across the desk at Karoline Leavitt. She wasn't moving. Not in the way people usually did on these shows. No nervous fidgeting, no habitual straightening of her blazer, no subtle glances toward the monitor to check how she looked on screen. She was just still, perfectly composed, her fingers resting lightly on a sleek tablet in front of her. That alone should have been enough to set off alarm bells. Because Brian, he was used to a certain type of opponent, the kind that came in thinking they were ready, armed with stats and snappy one-liners, only to realize, too late, that they walked straight into a trap. He'd been doing this for years. Making people look foolish was his sport, and he was undefeated. And tonight was just another game to him. Millions of people were watching, prime time, the kind of audience that made careers, or destroyed them. Brian adjusted his tie with a practiced ease, flashing his signature smirk, the one that said, "I've already won, you just don't know it yet." "So, Karoline," he started, his voice carrying that perfect blend of amusement and condescension. "What are we doing tonight? Another bombshell revelation that turns out to be nothing? Another desperate attempt to stir up controversy?" A soft chuckle rippled through the studio. Not loud, just enough. The crew had seen this before. Someone sitting across from Brian, convinced they were about to expose him, only to crumble the second he turned the conversation against them. It was textbook. A dance he had perfected. Let them talk, let them dig their own grave, and then deliver the finishing blow with one well-placed smirk. Karoline? She didn't blink. She didn't laugh, didn't shift in her seat, didn't do anything. Instead, she tilted her head just a little, just enough, and then she smiled. Not the kind of smile people expected. Not polite, not forced, not the fake, media-trained grin that everyone on these shows wore like armor. This was different. This was the kind of smile that made people uncomfortable. "Oh, Brian," she said smoothly, her voice calm, even playful. "You wish this was just another desperate attempt, but I promise you, by the time we're done here, your career won't look the same." And just like that, the shift. It wasn't obvious, not at first, but if you were paying attention, if you were watching closely, you could see it. The tiny flicker in Brian's eyes, the way his shoulders tensed just slightly before he forced them to relax, the microsecond of hesitation before he let out a little laugh, shaking his head like she was being ridiculous. He covered it well, but not well enough. "Well, that's dramatic," he said, leaning back in his chair like he wasn't the least bit concerned. "And what exactly am I supposed to be so afraid of?" Karoline didn't answer right away. She let the silence sit, let the weight of her words linger. Then, with deliberate slowness, she lifted a single finger and tapped the screen of her tablet. The soft click of her fingernail against the glass was the only sound in the studio. And somehow, it was the loudest sound in the world. "Oh, you'll see," she said simply. And in that moment, everyone watching, from the crew in the studio to the millions of people at home, knew one thing for sure. Something was about to happen, something big. There's a moment, right before everything falls apart, where time seems to pause. It's like the air thickens, the walls close in, and every single person in the room collectively realizes, this is bad. That moment hit the studio like a wrecking ball. Karoline didn't hesitate. She lifted her tablet, pressed a button, and boom! The screen behind them flickered to life. For a split second, nothing but static. Then, grainy footage, dim lighting, the unmistakable background noise of clinking glasses and muffled conversations. A bar, and sitting right in the middle of it, Brian Daniels himself. Not the polished, camera-ready version people were used to. No suit, no script, no carefully rehearsed sound bites. Just him, leaning back in his chair, drink in hand, grinning like he didn't have a care in the world. And then his voice. You know what the funniest part is? His words slurred just slightly, just enough. They actually believe me, like really believe me. These people eat up every word like it's gospel. Laughter, his and someone else's. Man, they're so easy to play. I could say anything, as long as I throw in the right buzzwords. It's a game. Politics. It's show business, baby. Boom. The studio went dead silent. Nobody moved. Not the camera operators. Not the producers behind the glass. Not even the audience at home. This wasn't some old, out-of-context clip. This wasn't some minor slip-up that could be explained away. This was Brian Daniels, in his own words, laughing about how easily he manipulated the very people who watched him every night. And the best part? He didn't know it was recorded. Karoline stayed quiet. She didn't need to say a word. The weight of the footage did all the talking. Brian, on the other hand, he snapped. This is fake. His voice cut through the silence, sharp and desperate. He shot up from his chair, face turning red. This is an edited clip, a pathetic, low-effort attempt to smear me. Karoline barely moved, just shifted her gaze to him, slow and deliberate, her lips curling into the kind of smirk that sent people into a panic. Oh, Brian. She leaned back, tilting her head slightly. You might want to sit down. I'm just getting started. And then, she tapped her screen again. The footage changed. New setting, a quiet, upscale restaurant, the kind with dim lighting and thick white tablecloths, where deals were made far away from microphones and press cameras. At the table, Brian Daniels, leaning in close to a well-known senator. Their voices were quieter here, more careful, but the mics had picked up every word. Look, you know how this works, Brian said, stirring his drink. There are certain topics we just can't touch. You and I both know that. The senator nodded. So you'll keep it off the air? Brian smirked. Of course. I can't have my audience getting too curious about certain things, right? Another pause, and then chaos. The live chat exploded. Social media lit up like a wildfire. Comments, reactions, real-time clips spreading like a virus. Brian Daniels, the man who had spent years branding himself as the fearless, honest voice of the people, had just been exposed in 4K by his own words. Karoline didn't look at the camera, didn't even acknowledge the thousands of reactions pouring in. She only had eyes for Brian, and judging by the sheer panic in his, he knew. This wasn't something he could talk his way out of. There are moments in life where you can see a person unraveling in real time. The slow-motion train wreck, the desperate scramble to hold on to whatever power they think they still have. That was Brian Daniels right now. His face was flushed, deep red, like all the air had been sucked out of his lungs. His carefully polished composure, shattered. His usual smug confidence, gone. Instead, he was gripping his mic with white-knuckled intensity, his breathing sharp, his eyes darting around like he was searching for an escape route that simply didn't exist. And then he snapped. This is an invasion of privacy. His voice was raw, almost shaking. He shot out of his chair, slamming a hand onto the desk. This is illegal. You can't just... Karoline barely reacted. She didn't lean back, didn't flinch, didn't even raise her voice. She just slowly shook her head. It's called investigative journalism, Brian. That alone was enough to send another shockwave through the studio, because let's be real, that was the line that changed everything. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't backtracking. She wasn't acting like this was some gotcha moment that just happened to land in her lap. No. She was saying in no uncertain terms that this was deliberate, this was calculated, and this was earned. She tilted her head, voice calm but sharp as a knife. You lied to people for years. You built an entire career on it. You laughed at them, manipulated them, cashed your checks, and never once thought it would catch up to you. But you made one fatal mistake. Brian's jaw clenched. His breathing was getting faster. And what's that? He spat. Karoline let the silence hang just long enough. People don't like being lied to. Boom. That was the final crack in the dam, because while Brian was standing there, chest heaving, trying to piece together some kind of defense, the real storm was happening outside of the studio, the network's social feeds, meltdown mode. Daniels exposed as a fraud? So everything he's ever said was just a script? How do these people sleep at night? Every second, the fire spread. Trending hashtags, reaction videos, live streams dissecting every single frame of those recordings. It wasn't just bad, it was career-ending. And Brian knew it. That's when his voice cracked, just slightly, but enough. "You ruined my life," he practically shouted, his fists clenching at his sides. Karoline's expression didn't change. No sympathy, no remorse, just brutal, cold truth. "No, Brian." She finally leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "You ruined it yourself." And in that moment, he knew she was right. There's a type of silence that feels unnatural, not the quiet of an empty room or the peaceful stillness before dawn. This was different. This was the silence of something breaking, something big. The kind of silence that only comes when people are too stunned to react, too frozen to even process what just happened. That was the studio the moment the screen cut to black. For a full 3 seconds, no one moved. Not the crew, not the producers, and not even Karoline. It was as if the entire set had been thrown into shock paralysis. Then, suddenly, the entire place exploded. Producers started barking orders into headsets, scrambling to figure out what to do next. Some were yelling at the control room, others frantically gesturing to the camera operators to cut to commercial. But the feed was already dead. The network had pulled the plug. They had no choice. Brian Daniels, their star, their guy, had just been caught red-handed. And worse, it wasn't rumors. It wasn't accusations. It was him, in his own words. There was no spinning this, no clever phrasing, no damage control strategy that could make this go away. The crew exchanged glances, some wide-eyed, some just staring at Karoline like she just detonated a bomb in the middle of the room, which, in a way, she had. But if Karoline felt the weight of the moment, she didn't show it. She sat back, crossed her arms, and simply watched as Brian Daniels completely fell apart. The second the cameras cut, Brian ripped his mic off, the tiny clip-on falling to the desk with a thud. His hands were shaking, whether from anger or sheer panic. It was impossible to tell, but one thing was crystal clear. He knew. He knew what just happened. He knew the second that footage played, his career, his entire legacy had just gone up in flames, and he wasn't taking it well. "This is an attack," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly as he spun toward the nearest producer. This is a setup. This is illegal." Nobody answered him. Nobody could. Because at that moment, their earpieces were blowing up with rapid-fire messages from the network headquarters. Damage control meetings were already being scheduled. Executives were demanding answers. Legal teams were being assembled. The entire company was shifting into crisis mode at lightning speed. Brian, though, he was too far gone to care. He stormed off the set, pushing past stunned crew members, muttering to himself as he grabbed his phone. "I'll sue. I'll take this entire network down. You think I won't?" But even as he said it, he knew the truth. He was finished. By the time Brian Daniels had locked himself in his office, desperately calling lawyers, the real chaos was unfolding outside the studio. The network was in full-blown meltdown mode. Phones were ringing non-stop. Executives were pacing hallways, shouting into their phones, their voices overlapping in a mess of legal threats, damage control strategies, and PR crisis meetings. How bad is it? One of the junior analysts stared at a giant screen, watching as their audience, their own viewers, turned against them in real time. He swallowed hard before answering, "Sir, it's bad." And that was an understatement. Trending hashtags were everywhere. #Daniels exposed #. Liberal media lies #truth matters. The network had spent years cultivating its audience, building trust, crafting the illusion that they were the ultimate source of information. Now, that illusion had shattered, and the advertisers saw it too. One by one, the biggest sponsors, the ones who kept the lights on, started pulling out. We do not support misinformation. Our brand stands for integrity in journalism. We are reevaluating our partnership with the network moving forward. Translation: we are not going down with this sinking ship. Then came the final blow, a single statement, cold and clinical, released by the network itself. Effective immediately, Brian Daniels is temporarily suspended pending further review. Temporarily. Yeah, sure. Anyone who understood how these things worked knew what that really meant. He wasn't coming back. And even if he did, his reputation was already destroyed. Meanwhile, across town, Karoline sat in the quiet of her dressing room. The glow of her laptop screen illuminated her face as she scrolled through the endless flood of headlines. Brian Daniels exposed. Career in jeopardy after bombshell footage. Network in crisis. Will they recover? Karoline Leavitt ends Brian Daniels in live TV showdown. Her phone buzzed constantly. Calls, messages, interview requests. People reaching out, some to congratulate her, some to demand answers, some just hoping to attach themselves to whatever storm she had just created. She ignored them all. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, tapping a finger against her knee as she watched. This should have felt like a victory, and in a way, it did. Brian Daniels had spent years controlling the conversation. He decided what people should believe, what questions they were allowed to ask, and for a long time, it worked, because he knew something most people didn't. The truth doesn't matter if you control the narrative, but the thing about the truth, it doesn't stay buried forever, and when it finally comes out, it doesn't just hurt, it destroys. Karoline exhaled slowly, letting her eyes linger on the biggest headline of the night. The fall of Brian Daniels. She closed her laptop with a soft snap. Then she stood up, grabbing her jacket, smoothing it over her shoulders. Because this wasn't over, not even close. What would you have done in Brian Daniels' place? Would you have tried to defend yourself or disappear from the spotlight? Share your thoughts in the comments. How do you think this story should have ended? Have you or someone you know ever been in a situation where the truth came out unexpectedly? How did it change things? Let's talk about it. Hit the like button if you want more stories like this, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next big reveal. This story isn't just about drama, it's about shedding light on important issues and making the world a better place.